everybody. My name is Patrick Boston. I am a senior architect with Integral Partners, part of the Zalian Group. Today at Developer Days, I'm going to be presenting to you a NodeJS utility that I built to help export, tokenize, and deploy IDN configuration objects via the SPConfig APIs. So what is this tool? It is a simple Node.js command line utility written in JavaScript running on Node.js. It is inspired by the IdentityIQ SSB, or Services Standard Build. So for those of you that have experience with IdentityIQ, the SSB is a really great tool that SailPoint provided through their professional services that helps you really streamline your deployment of configuration files, helps you put them in a repository and manage them. So this tool is inspired by that, and it also helps you export IDN, or Identity Security Cloud configuration objects, tokenizes them, and deploys them to other environments, just like the IIQ SSB did. It uses the SPConfig export and import endpoints via the TypeScript SDK, which is provided by the developer relations team. So this TypeScript SDK really helps accelerate your development. So rather than you writing all of your own code to hit particular endpoints to, upload sources or transforms, whatever it is, you can just simply, instantiate objects such as like the sources API, pass in some simple configuration for the credentials that need to be used to connect to a particular IDN tenant, and easily, maintain your configuration through these SDKs. So some of the features that this tool helps provide with your environment configuration promotion. So it allows you to export objects, obviously, any objects which are supported by the SPConfig APIs. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth later, but there's a lot of objects that you can export with SPConfig APIs, but you cannot necessarily import all of those same objects. So there are some limitations there. So things such as email templates, for example, they can be exported, but they cannot be imported with SPConfig APIs. The tool also allows you to tokenize objects. So we'll get into this more later, but it helps you genericize and tokenize the object parameters per environment. So something like sources, where they're going to have different configuration values for an environment that you connect to from Sandbox, which is a non-production environment of an application, versus production, where you're actually going to connect to a production environment. And then it allows you to build those tokenized objects. So replacing tokens with the actual values that you're going to deploy to an actual IDN tenant to connect to that application, or something in a rule or transform, for example, that needs to be tokenized with different values for whatever reason that may be. Very similar again to the SSB. And then lastly, after those objects are built with the values that are needed for the target tenant, you can go and import those objects in an automated fashion. And we'll see later in the demo, this is all through very simple commands that we're just going to run through our terminal. Okay, so some of the benefits. So one of the first real big ones, I've had some trouble, coming from IdentityIQ and going to Identity Security Clouds. One of the biggest, issues that I ran to right away is, having repository-oriented objects. Right, so all of our objects typically have some sort of metadata that is like environment specific, and we want to omit that metadata from these objects so that they're more repository oriented. So things such as ID, created timestamps, modified timestamps, etc. These are things that we don't necessarily want to be storing in our objects or committing to a repository, because they're things that may change every time you export it. I don't want to see a modified timestamp as a difference in my object that I'm trying to commit to source code. The next thing that we kind of spoke briefly about already is the tokenization helps generalize configuration values, right? So again, as we're configuring sources and transforms or whatever through the UI in Identity Security Cloud and exporting those objects, they're going to have values that are specific for that environment, for downstream applications that you're connecting to, et cetera. And again, when we're committing to a repository, we don't want to have those specific values. We want to genericize the object one singular object that can be maintained rather than exporting everything from sandbox and everything from production and committing them as they are to, separate directories or something like that. Something else that we can, experiment with this that I'll show later in the tool is something like cloud rules. The source code can be extracted to a separate file, or, our connector rules as well. So those of you that have deployed rules, the source code is encapsulated in a single line of JSON that's, escaped, and to manage those, you have to unescape it and re-escape it to redeploy it. So we can help kind of make code more readable and modify it easier by extracting the source code to separate, more readable files. The next benefit is CI/CD integrations, right? Since we're using Node.js, and it's really a command line utility, it makes it CI/CD friendly. So standing this up on a CI/CD platform such as like Jenkins or Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions, and simply installing Node.js and cloning this repository with a tool allows us to easily build pipeline scripts that will allow us to tokenize configuration and send it out to a particular environment and deploy it. There's also other potential integrations for sensitive data, such as like passwords or tokens, to be pulled from like a PAM or secret store and injected before being deployed to a target environment. Next, we have improved processes, right? So a lot of what I've seen so far with Identity Security Cloud, and with the exception of like Configuration Hub and maybe some other tools that are out there, a lot of clients struggle with the deployment process from going to like sandbox to production, for example, because they're doing things manually, right? They don't know how to automate this stuff. They don't have the tools to do it. So what they're doing is, creating a source in sandbox and getting it all set up, ready to go, and then kind of recreating it in production by hand and copying and pasting and changing values that are needed for, connecting to a downstream application, for example. So this tool is aimed to help avoid the manual configuration promotions going up in the higher environments, which can be error prone, right? Flipping back and forth, trying to get things stood up in the next environment. Next, we have efficiency of deployments can be improved through a tool like this, right? So rather than doing those manual deployments, as long as, using a tool like this, all the developers on your team are following the new standard of committing things to source code repository and tokenizing objects and all that good stuff. It can be as simple as, running one or two commands to go and get objects migrated to the next environment, as opposed to maybe the couple hour-long process that it would take before to manually copy things up. And then lastly, for the improved process, right, we have auditing of source codes, source code objects, and deployments when utilizing CI/CD, right? So now all of our developers, using a tool like this are starting to check all of their configuration and code into a repository where we have our history, our commits, all that good stuff. You can follow other, patterns using, pull requests and approvals and things like that within your remote repository tools that you may have. So why did I choose Node.js for developing this tool? So first off, the Southpoint DevRel team provides a TypeScript SDK, which is awesome. You can find that on the developer website. Again, I mentioned this earlier, but it really helps speed up the development process. I didn't have to sit here and write my own custom functions for hitting sources API, etc. I am simply I can simply just instantiate an object for sources API and call to create a source or update a source or add a schema to a source. It's very convenient. Next, the Southpoint SaaS connector framework actually utilizes Node.js and TypeScript as well. So if you don't have much experience with the SaaS connector framework yet, the SaaS connectors are actually written in TypeScript. There's a bunch of them out there on the developer community, which you can actually download, and you can compile them with Node.js before you upload them to a tenant with the SailPoint CLI. So kind of following that same vein, right? This is where things are going, so why not just also develop in the same sort of platform? JavaScript and TypeScript allows us to easily interact with JavaScript objects, right? So this is a pretty easy one. Natively through JavaScript, we can, everything now through the SailPoint APIs is interacting with JSON objects, right? So JavaScript really helps, again, streamline that, right? Rather than, there's plenty of other languages out there that interact easily with, JSON objects, but JavaScript is built to do that natively, so it helps us out there. Next, we have modern package management with NPM. So again, because this is a TypeScript SDK that the SailPoint DevRel team is managing and updating as there's new versions of that with changes to API endpoints or whatever new API endpoints that become available. As long as they're building and maintaining the SDK, we can easily just pull the newest version of that SDK with simple node commands. And lastly, it's lightweight and easy to install, right? So going back to like the pipeline use case, the CI/CD use case, we can easily go install Node.js on a server or a CI/CD platform and just go and clone our repository for this tool and start running the commands that are necessary. So why SPConfig for this tool? So objects such as sources have reference objects nested, and the SPConfig import, for example, handles creating references to those objects. So if you've maintained sources, for example, through like v3 endpoints, creating a new source is a series of steps, right? You have to create the source, and then you have to create the schemas that are tied to the source. So you need the ID of that source to like go back and hit the create schema endpoint and tie it. Same thing with like provisioning policies and whatever else you might be tying to that source. The way that objects are exported through SPConfig is everything is nested in one big object for the most part, right? So your schemas are actually like a part of the same file. And when you import that source file, everything is kind of dynamically created behind the scenes so that you don't have to go and hit 3 different endpoints to create a source, create a schema, create provisioning policies, for example. Rules are migrated through SPConfig. Actually, I think it's really the only way that rules can be migrated now. That's a cloud rule or a connector rule. So by using SPConfig, we already have that added benefit of being able to migrate rules easily. Importing simply requires a single JSON file with all the objects you want to import. And there's actually some maybe discoveries I made through testing this tool that may not necessarily always be true. Maybe the SPConfig import doesn't always work that way, depending on what you put in your files. But in theory, if you put 3 different sources in one big JSON file, that the SPConfig import expects like a particular format. If you've used it before, you're familiar with that. So I could put some sources, some transforms, some rules all in one file and run a single import command rather than, again, going and hitting various like v3 endpoints to create various objects. Next, it's easily configurable to include or exclude what you want to export and maintain, right? So we're creating all sorts of objects in our IDN tenants, transforms, rules, sources. There might be some out-of-the-box stuff. There might be some default transforms that we don't necessarily want to export and maintain because we know they're there out of the box. We don't need to export them out. So the SPConfig export process allows you to easily, include or exclude what you want to export. And lastly, this is, SPConfig is almost SSB-esque, again, back to like the first point of like the reference objects and things like that. The IDNIQ SSB kind of follow the same pattern where your application would have all of your reference, provisioning policies and all that good stuff. Okay, so getting into some of the core configuration of the tool now that we'll see in the live demo in a minute here. So one of the first files that we have is our whatever environment that it's for. This could be, you can name it SB, sandbox, prod, production, whatever you want to call it. You'll have multiples of these files for the various environments that you want to connect to, whatever tenants you have. So for example, we could have sb.env.js. This is going to be a config object which points to an environment you want to export objects to or deploy from, or I'm sorry, export from or deploy to. It's going to require a personal access token, client ID, and secret to interact with the SPConfig APIs. That personal access token will have to have the necessary scopes assigned to it. So that can be like the global admin scope, or I think there's some other ones that are tied down to just using SPConfig. So you have things in here like your base URL, your token URL, and then obviously your personal access token, client ID, and secret to actually interact with that particular tenant via APIs. Next, we have our export config JS. This is another configuration object which holds what objects you want to export from a given environment based on your SPConfig export. So, for example, a typical pattern might be that you're going to go and configure things initially in your sandbox environment, and then you'll probably want to export it out of that sandbox environment before tokenizing and deploying to another environment. So your export config is kind of a global file that can be applied whenever you run the export, but most of the time you're probably going to be exporting out of like your sandbox environment. So this is where you want to what I mentioned earlier, you can include the types of objects that you want to export, exclude the types of objects you want to exclude. And then you can also boil down, you'll see under the object options, you can say, hey, I only want to, within the sources that I'm exporting, I only want to export like my Active Directory source by name. And you can also do it by ID, you can see there as well. Tokenization, I've been talking about this a lot, right? And we'll see this even more in the demo to give you a real idea. But again, the concept of tokenization is like replacing specific environmental values with tokens during export using JSON path. So we're all very familiar with JSON path here. So again, this is another pattern that I wanted to use. You're using these things in workflows and other places throughout the tool. And so we're going to, again, from the Identity IQ SSB, this is called reverse tokenization. So this is as the object is being exported using that JSON path. You'll see in the left-hand side screenshot there, for example, the owner ID of like my Active Directory source, I can replace with this token that kind of uses the %% name %%. And then those tokens can be replaced with actual values that are needed for the target environment that you want to deploy this object to later on. So on the right-hand screenshot there, you can see, for example, the tokens that we did during our reverse tokenization. When we deploy this object, we can, deploy the actual owner ID and our IQ service port, for example, if the port is different from Sandbox than it is in production. Something like our owners are always going to be different. So these are things that come in handy when you need to, resolve those references for owners, for example. Okay, so before I get into the demo, just some issues and limitations that I found developing this tool and testing it out. So I mentioned this earlier, but the SPConfig APIs actually have some limitations on what can be exported and imported. There's more objects that you can export than you can import. Again, an example I mentioned earlier is like email templates, right? So if you want to manage email templates, and they can't really be done through this pipeline today, but something to consider changes for in the future, maybe refactoring this tool to use different endpoints for different types of objects. The IDN APIs in general rely heavily on ID references as opposed to like name references, right? So this makes migration of objects very tedious sometimes. For example, object owners of sources or workflows also have owners. Various objects have owners. They have an ID defined, so lookup and tokenization must be performed, as opposed to like letting the import process just create the owning identity if it doesn't exist, for example. With Identity IQ and the SSB import process, like your application owner, for example, if it didn't exist in the target environment, it would create like a shell of an identity just so it could resolve that reference. With Identity Security Cloud, we need to make sure that like that identity exists first so that it can be defined as the owner. And if it doesn't, you're going to run into errors when you're trying to perform your import or deployment process. One other thing I found, the SPConfig import only imports one source object at a time, even if more than one source is defined in an import file. So you might want to deploy a few sources at once, but through my testing, it'll only take, I think, like the last one that's in the file. The SPConfig APIs do not export encrypted attributes such as passwords. So if you compare SPConfig to like v3 sources endpoint, the v3 sources endpoint will actually export like encrypted passwords for service accounts and things like that. So you at least know where they are, and you might be able to tokenize them with like local secret tokenization. But the SPConfig export process doesn't pull those out automatically. I think you can still possibly deploy them, but it means you have to kind of go and find where they're at or where they should be. And then any subsequent imports, what I found, can clear out those encrypted attributes. So if you're like deploying updates to a source, for example, you might need to re-enter those credentials even though they were there prior. And then lastly, what I mentioned before about the dependencies, your SPConfig imports can actually fail if reference objects do not exist yet. So for example, if you're trying to deploy an identity profile from Sandbox to your production environment, and a source does not exist yet for an identity attribute, like a direct identity attribute that's referenced from a source, you'll receive a dependency failure like the example that you see below. So you have to make sure all of those dependencies are set up properly. So you might need to run multiple imports to make sure you get your transforms in first, then you do your sources and your identity profiles. I haven't really built in that like dependency import order into this tool yet. I'm going to skip that slide for now, and then we can go ahead and switch over to the demo. Okay, so what I'm going to be showing you guys today is exporting a source from one of my tenants that I have here to another tenant that I have. So the first tenant I have up is my DevRel tenant. Thanks to Jordan and the team for that. I have a simple JDBC source defined here. I'm just going to kind of click in here and show you guys. It's a very simple source. I don't have any accounts aggregated or anything. It's actually not hooked up to a database. It's just a very simple source to show you guys that all of the configuration that I set up can be exported, tokenized, and deployed to another environment. So we see here, very simple description and all that stuff. And then under our account settings, I have like a username, password, URL, and that's pretty much it. These are just some of the things that we're going to maintain through our export and tokenization process that I'll show here in a minute. And then if we go to my other tenant, this is one of my company's partner tenants. If we look here and just do a live search and refresh for you guys, just to show you that my dev days JDBC source does not exist in this environment yet. Okay, so let's actually hop into the tool here. So as I kind of spoke about in the slides, one of the first configuration files that we have to set up here is our export config.js. So this is a simple, JSON file. It's again following the SPConfig export, schema that you have to use. So for the demo here, I'm just going to be exporting my single source called devdays JDBC. So really quickly, just have some of my commands over here on the side that I can copy and throw over. So we're going to pull up our terminal here. Just make this a little bit bigger. And the first command that I'm going to run here is, is just our export process. And you can see here that I have my source environment defined as SB. Because it's using my couple of files here that are prepended with SB. So I'm not going to open it, but my env.js file contains my client ID and secret and the URL for my Sandbox environment. And we'll go ahead and run our export process. So we have some nice output here letting us know that it's going and performing the tenant export based off what we told it to export in our export config here. And you can see that it showed us that it was exporting our devdays JDBC source based off our config here. We have some other stuff in here that I was, toying around with before. For example, it told us that it couldn't find any reverse tokenization for our Active Directory source here, or our Active Directory source didn't get exported because I didn't tell it to. So we get some good feedback in our console here. And then it checked our file, our dev-days JDBC file, to see if there was any any values that it needed to reverse tokenize, and we didn't find anything, or else you'd see some more output here. So what that did was it created a new config directory here, you'll see, and there's one subdirectory called source. You'll have multiple subdirectories if you're maintaining other objects such as transforms and rules and whatever else, identity profiles. And we have our dev-days JDBC source here. So one of the things I talked about earlier is, maintaining this as like a singular object in our source code repositories. So you'll see things such as IDs and created timestamps and modified timestamps are all omitted from this file. That way, again, it's something that doesn't show up as a difference as we make core configuration changes to this and export it. We don't have differences for metadata like that. And then now we have basically our raw file here that we exported straight out. I don't have any tokenization value set up yet. So for example, what you'll see here is we have our user that was defined in the source in the sandbox environment, and then we have like our URL, right? So what I want to do is I actually want to perform some reverse tokenization, right? So when I export this object, I want these values to be replaced with tokens, and then those tokens can be replaced with values for a target tenant that I want to deploy to. So what I want to show here is if we look at our reverse.target.js, I didn't talk about this file in the slides, but this is where we're going to use that JSON path to actually, just clean this up, to actually replace configuration values that are coming out of that export with these tokens to genericize the object and make it easy to deploy to other environments. So now that we have those couple of reverse properties set up, we can go ahead and run our export again out of Sandbox. And we'll see our console looks a little bit different than before last time. Now we can see that there's a couple of tokens that got injected rather than retaining the actual values for those configurations. If we go back now to our dev-days JDBC file, we can see the URL now has a token and our username now has a token, right? And then the next thing that we need to do is set this object up using tokenization to our target environment that we want to deploy to. So we need to replace those tokens now with actual values for the target tenant when we go and deploy. So we're going to be deploying again to my partner tenant, partner 4164 here. So I have another environment set up here with my couple of files for my personal access token. And then this is going to be our target.js file is going to actually be the values for the tokens that we want to send to that particular environment. So just pulling over a couple of token values that I have on the side here. So now, for example, in our JDBC source here, our dev-days JDBC URL, we want to replace with a slightly different URL, right? Let's act like we're going from Sandbox to production. And our URL now has, underscore 4164 on the end of it, as opposed to just, not having that in our Sandbox environment. And then kind of the same thing with our username here. We're just appending 4164 to the end of that. And now what we can do is we can actually build these objects before we import them into the next environment. So we can go ahead and just run our build command here with the target environment that we want to that we're eventually going to deploy to. We're not actually going to deploy the new source yet. We just want to build and validate that the tokenization that we're setting up is going to work. So a new directory just got created here, the build directory. So this is going to have a config directory under it for all of the files that you want to include in your build. And now this is going to be the actual source that gets imported into your target environment when we actually go and run the deploy command. So you'll see some things now our token values or our tokens get actually restored with actual values that we deployed in our target JS files. So now again, we set up our URL and our username to have 4164 at the end of them, and now we actually see those values here in the URL and the username. Okay, so now next thing I'm going to do here is we can actually run the deploy command to attempt to deploy this source to our next environment, which is that 4164 partner tenant. Now this is actually going to fail. It's expected. I just want to show you guys some of the dependency failures that you can run into, and then how you can resolve them quickly with this tool. So now we'll go ahead and run the deploy command to go to our 4164 tenant. And we can kind of see here live, it's running the SPConfig import. This is the job ID that it's running it with. So it periodically goes and checks like every like second or probably faster than that here, and just checks the progress of that job. And then once it's completed, it lets us know. So we did get an error as expected, and it's basically saying, hey, the owner that you have defined in your source, the ID and name, was not able to be resolved in our target environment. Well, that's because, my name and ID, for me to be the owner of the source in that environment, is different. So in order to resolve that, I'm going to go ahead and go back to our reverse tokenization, because in the future going forward, we want to continue to, again, genericize this object and allow us to tokenize the owner easily. So if people are making changes to this object in the future, they're updating a SQL query, or the URL changes, when they go to export those changes, we're going to retain these tokens when they do that export. So here I'm going to add a couple new tokens for the owner, or a couple reverse tokenizations for the owner ID and the owner name. And then when we deploy this, or build it before we deploy it, we actually want to deploy my ID and name in that next target tenant that we're deploying to. So if we go back to our target JS for 4164, we're going to add a couple more tokens in here as well. And so this is my ID and my name in that target environment, so that I can be resolved successfully as the owner of that source. So kind of starting from the top again, now if we re-export out of Sandbox, or my DevRel tenant, which I have labeled as Sandbox here, we should see now we have a couple more reverse tokenization properties that got applied for our owner ID and our owner name. And if we look at that source in our config directory, again, not our build directory, just our config directory where the objects are being maintained and can be committed to a repository, now we see our owner ID and name actually have our tokens because we applied those new, reverse tokenization rules. And now we can actually go ahead and deploy that object again, and we should be successful this time because we set up all of the tokenization to set me up as the proper owner ID and name in the target environment. Okay, so comparing to before, we got an error, right, for that unresolved reference, and now the SPConfig feedback tells us that we have one object imported, which is our devdays JDBC source. So again, didn't exist before. We do a refresh here, and now it exists. So we'll just go ahead and jump right into what it looks like right after it's imported through this process. So we see right now I'm resolved as the owner of this source. Again, I think this may be able to be imported with SPConfig, but by default, when you export with SPConfig, it doesn't include the VA cluster that you have configured. You may be able to include it after the fact, but one of the first things you're going to have to do is come in here and set up you set up your virtual appliance cluster. And then the next thing is going to be where we had our credentials. You'll see there's not a password here, right? So you would have to come in and manually set up your password. Again, those things are not being exported by SPConfig APIs, but I think you still be able to manually put them in the file and then have them be uploaded. And then you can see our tokenization work properly because comparing to what the source looked like in our sandbox environment that we exported out of, right? It was just, dev days as the URL, dev days dev as the username, and now we actually have the 4164 appended to it that we had set up in our tokenization. Okay, so that's deploying the new source. One of the other things that I just kind of wanted to quickly demo here is how you can now easily make changes to that source going forward, right? So we just come out of here and save everything. Okay. So for example, let's say we needed some new schema attributes to be added to our source. So we can come into the source in our sandbox environment in my DevRel tenant here, and we could add a new schema attribute. Let's call this foo2 because I already have a foo. And we can go ahead and save that new schema attribute. And if we go and look at the current state of the source, where we have our embedded schema inside of the source object, we just see ID, display name foo, which is what it currently was right before I added the new foo2 schema account attribute. So what we can do now is go ahead and run our export process again, and we should kind of see the file update live in the background here. Okay, and now we see our new foo2 schema attribute. And then again, all of our reverse tokenization and everything stays intact. So when we go and deploy this again, things like the owner and everything will just stay consistent based off what we set up previously. And now if we go ahead and deploy this again, let's just go ahead and take a look at the source in our target tenant. If we look at the account schema there, right, we just have ID, display name foo, which it was previously. And then we can go ahead and run our deploy to our 4164 tenant again and make updates to that source, right? So we can create it and then we can maintain it after and continually make updates to it. We just do a refresh here. And now we have foo2. And so, as I mentioned earlier, not necessarily demoing it right now, but we can start to maintain more objects, right? So again, anything that the SPConfig APIs can export, you can have stored in your source code repository. You might not be able to import all of those with SPConfig, but for example, let's just go ahead and include transforms in our export types here, and we can run our export process again. And you'll see now we exported our dev days JDBC source again, but now we exported a whole bunch of, transforms as well now. So our config directory now looks a little bit different. We have another subdirectory called transform where we could go and look at all of our JSON for our transforms, and then we can easily start to deploy these to other environments as well, right? Okay, so that's pretty much it for the demo. I just have one more slide that I wanted to go through really quickly. So looking forward for this tool, based off some of the limitations that I've run into with SPConfig APIs, the plans are to kind of refactor the entire export-import process using V3 and beta API endpoints. So this is something I'm kind of in the process of doing because I think SailPoint is focusing more on configuration hub. I haven't really seen any changes or improvements to these SPConfig export or import API endpoints, but the V3 and beta API endpoints are constantly being updated. There's private endpoints that are becoming public that are going to enable us to hopefully do more things in the future. So I'm in the process of already kind of refactoring, for example, sources to utilize all of the V3 endpoints. It's just a little bit more tedious and requires more code because you have to orchestrate the whole process yourself of, creating a source if it doesn't exist, and then, attaching the schemas to that source, or if the schema already exists, doing a put command as opposed to creating a whole new schema. And this will allow management of other object types that SPConfig does not allow imports for. So, for example, lifecycle states, notification templates, etc., that I talked about before. Notification templates, for example, are a huge object that you're going to want to easily migrate up through environments, and SPConfig does not allow for importing of those today, and that's something that we're going to want to help our customers with. So, refactoring this will help us with that. Supporting more configuration migration as more public APIs are released. So Colin's doing a great job of keeping us all updated on things such as, correlation config and, running unoptimized account aggregations and things like that are all things that could be built out into these tools and, CI/CD pipelines. Managing cloud rule or connector rule source scripts. I want to hopefully be able to extract those, make them more readable, and then auto inject them back into the JSON source upon deployment rather than manually unescaping the source code that's encapsulated in the JSON and re-escaping it before you deploy it. A little bit of a tedious process there. And then importing objects in a specific order. Starting at the bottom and making sure that our transforms and rules exist before we, upload our identity profiles that may rely on those, or our sources that rely on a connector rule, to avoid all of those dependency issues. And that's it for me. Wrapping up a little bit early, so give you guys a little bit of time back before the next one, and thank you so much.